What if everything you thought you knew about your past was turned upside down in one shocking moment? A billionaire leaves his wife for a younger woman, but years later, a twist he never saw coming will change everything. Could the children you never knew you had been staring right back at you? He had everything. Wealth, power, a life that most could only dream of. Luxury cars, sprawling mansions, and parties with the elite. He was the definition of success. But none of it mattered anymore. Deep down, he felt empty. His heart was elsewhere. In the beginning, it was easy to forget, easy to pretend that fame and fortune could fill the void inside him. But as the years passed, the cracks in his life began to show. The woman who had stood by him through it all, his wife, was no longer enough. The passion was gone, replaced by a cold routine. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The thought of someone younger, someone who could reignite his fading excitement, became too tempting to resist. The life he built wasn't enough to hold his attention anymore. He wanted more. And in that search, everything would change. At first, their love had been undeniable. It was the kind of romance that everyone envied, passionate, full of hope, and driven by mutual ambition. They were partners in every sense of the word, building their lives from the ground up. But as time passed, cracks began to form. It wasn't one event, but a series of small things. At first, the long hours at the office didn't seem to matter. He was building an empire, and she stood by his side, proud of what they were creating. Yet as the years went on, those hours stretched longer, and his work became all-consuming. She tried to fill the silence in their home with conversations, with plans for the future, but he was always distant, his mind elsewhere. She could see the change in him, the growing disinterest, and it broke her heart. She wasn't sure when it started, but she knew it was happening. The man she married, the man who used to look at her with such love and admiration, was no longer the same. She felt like a stranger in her own home. She reached out, tried to make him understand, but his responses were always vague, polite, but detached. He would offer a quick smile, a few words, but they were hollow, as though he was already living in a different world. As the years dragged on, the emotional distance between them grew. She fought for their marriage, tried everything she could think of to bring them back to the place they once shared. But no matter how much she tried, no matter how hard she worked to reconnect, he was slipping away. She saw the signs, the way his eyes would glaze over when she spoke, the way his attention seemed always focused on something else. The passion, the intimacy, it all seemed to disappear. And it wasn't just the physical distance, it was the emotional disconnect that left her feeling alone. She could feel him withdrawing, and the harder she tried to keep things together, the more frustrated she became. She would catch herself wondering if this was what they had become, two people just living side by side, but never truly seeing each other. She tried not to give up, to keep fighting for them. But deep down, she feared that she was losing him. And as much as she wished it were just a phase, a temporary shift, she knew deep inside that something more had changed. His attention, his energy, his heart, it was no longer hers. He was slipping away, and she feared that nothing would bring him back. It started as an idea, a whisper in his mind. But it didn't take long before it became an obsession, a thought he couldn't shake. The weight of his marriage was no longer lifting him, it was dragging him down. He couldn't ignore it any longer, the restlessness, the longing for something more. She had tried. She had begged, cried, and fought for their love, but somewhere along the way, he stopped fighting with her. His eyes wandered, his heart was elsewhere. One evening, sitting in the silence of their living room, he thought about how much he craved something new, something different. The younger woman, full of life and energy, offered him an escape from the monotony of his routine. She was exciting, she was fresh, and for the first time in years, she made him feel alive again. He tried to tell himself that it was just a fleeting feeling, that it was just a passing attraction. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. It was more than that. He had fallen for the illusion of youth, of vitality. It wasn't just about physical attraction, it was the way she made him feel seen, appreciated, and wanted in ways he hadn't felt in years. He began to question everything. Was this what he wanted? A life full of endless routine, the same conversations with a woman who no longer excited him, or was it time to move on and try to reignite the spark he once had? His wife had changed too. She was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with. The connection they once shared felt like a distant memory. She had become a stranger, someone who shared the same house but no longer shared his heart. He tried to make excuses to justify staying, but the truth was undeniable: he was no longer happy. The life they had built, once so full of promise, had become a cage. The decision wasn't easy. He spent nights tossing and turning, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But in the end, the desire for something new, something that made him feel alive again, outweighed the guilt. He couldn't stay. He couldn't pretend anymore. The pull of the younger woman was stronger than the ties that bound him to his past. He made the choice that would change everything. He walked into the kitchen, sat down across from her, and told her. No anger, no shouting. Just words, simple and final. He was leaving. The look on her face, the shock, the confusion, the sadness, haunted him. But there was no turning back. He had already made his choice. Life with her was everything he had imagined. The excitement, the thrill of being with someone so young, so full of energy. Every day felt like a new adventure. She brought a spark into his life that he had long since lost, a vitality that had been missing for years. It was like he had been living in a world of gray and suddenly, everything was in color again. They went on spontaneous trips, danced through the night, and spent hours talking about everything and nothing. He felt alive again, intoxicated by her presence, her laugh, the way she looked at him with admiration. But as time went on, something began to change. The newness started to fade, and the man found himself looking for more than just the physical attraction that had once held his attention. He started noticing the little things, the ways in which their conversations lacked depth, the constant need for validation that came from her. She was beautiful, no doubt, but there were moments when the excitement turned into a quiet emptiness. The life he had left behind now seemed like something he couldn't fully escape. The excitement had shifted into a constant craving for something he couldn't define. They fought more often. Small arguments, disagreements about nothing. It felt like the connection they once shared was now overshadowed by a growing tension. The man started to feel that familiar sense of loneliness creeping in again. She was still young, still beautiful, but he was beginning to wonder if this was really the life he wanted. Was this truly happiness, or was he simply avoiding the emotional turmoil he had left behind with his ex-wife? The absence of genuine intimacy began to weigh on him. She was always around, but he started to question if they truly knew each other. The carefree days they shared slowly morphed into a routine, one that left him wondering if he had just traded one cage for another. At times, he would catch himself thinking about his ex-wife, the way she used to look at him, the warmth in her eyes. He had left her because he thought he wanted something more, something different, but now, with his new partner, he wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. There were no more late-night conversations, no more deep connections. It was all surface level, all excitement without substance. He had thought that leaving his past life behind would make him happy, but now, it felt like the emptiness he had tried to escape was slowly creeping back. He tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on the present, but the cracks began to show. The life he thought would bring him happiness was starting to feel like an illusion, and he was left with the same questions that had haunted him before. As the months turned into years, the initial excitement began to fade. What once felt like an adventure became routine, and the man found himself questioning everything he had chosen. The newness of the relationship wore off, and the cracks began to show. The woman he had once admired so intensely for her youth and vitality now felt more like an image he had projected onto someone else. She had become someone who demanded constant attention and validation, and he, in turn, began to feel drained by her neediness. The carefree days were replaced with a series of monotonous patterns. They still went out, still enjoyed each other's company, but there was a growing sense of discomfort in his chest. He couldn't ignore the deepening sense of regret. He had left everything behind, the stability, the family he had built, the love of his wife, for something that had promised excitement but had failed to deliver true fulfillment. He began to look back on the past, on the marriage he had abandoned. He remembered the warmth of his wife's presence, her unwavering support, and the quiet, steady love they had once shared. She had been there for him in ways he hadn't appreciated, and now, he realized how much he had taken her for granted. There were moments when he would hear her name mentioned in passing, or catch a glimpse of someone who resembled her, and it would trigger a deep ache in his chest. He would quickly push the thought away, but the guilt, the remorse, started to build inside him. His new life, which he thought would bring him happiness, had instead left him feeling isolated. The woman he had chosen over his family was not the answer to his problems. She couldn't fill the emptiness he felt. The excitement that had once been so intoxicating now seemed like a distraction, a temporary fix to a much deeper issue. He had escaped from his past, but now it was becoming clear that his past was never truly gone. It was still there, haunting him in the quiet moments, in the late-night thoughts that kept him awake. Over time, the distance between them grew. He no longer found himself as invested in their conversations, their plans, their shared future. His mind often wandered back to the life he had left behind, to the wife who had been so understanding, so patient, and to the family he had torn apart. What had he done? He couldn't go back, couldn't undo the past, but the regret weighed on him more heavily every day. His relationship with the younger woman began to feel like a mere escape from his own reality, a way to avoid confronting the mistakes he had made. It was no longer about love or passion, it was about distraction. And in that distraction, he realized he had lost touch with the most important part of his life, himself. One cold afternoon, the billionaire found himself sitting at his usual spot in a quiet café, his coffee in hand as he gazed out the window. His mind was adrift, lost in thought. The day was dull, the usual noise of the city muted by the thick glass of the café's window. It was the kind of moment he had grown accustomed to, empty, lonely, yet filled with the weight of what he had left behind. He looked at his reflection in the window, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. As he took a sip of his coffee, something caught his eye. A woman was walking on the sidewalk, her figure moving through the crowd. It was an ordinary scene, nothing out of the ordinary. But as she got closer, his breath caught in his throat. The woman walking past the café window was his ex-wife. For a split second, his heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen her in years, and yet, there she was, walking with the kind of quiet confidence he remembered from their early days together. She looked older, yes, but still the same, strong, poised, and beautiful in a way that didn't need to be flashy. He could see the weight of time on her, but it didn't diminish her presence. He watched as she passed by, her eyes forward, not noticing him behind the glass. But then, something else caught his attention. Two young boys were walking alongside her. The twins. At first, he didn't fully process what he was seeing. His eyes darted between the woman and the children, his mind racing. The boys, identical in every way, were clearly her children, but there was something about them that made his heart race again. They looked like him. His jaw clenched. He wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light, a coincidence, but the resemblance was undeniable. The same hair, the same eyes, the same smile. They walked with a confidence that mirrored his own from years ago, and for a moment, he was struck by the overwhelming realization that these boys, his boys, had grown up without him. As the family continued down the street, the man sat frozen, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. He couldn't look away. His heart felt heavy in his chest. The children, his flesh and blood, were right there, and he had never known them. He had missed their entire lives. His decision, the one he had made all those years ago, was now staring him in the face. For the first time, he felt truly lost. His mind swirled with emotions: guilt, regret, disbelief. The woman he had once loved, the life he had discarded so carelessly, the children he never even knew existed, they were all right there, walking past him. And he had nothing to show for it. As he sat there, still stunned, his mind refused to accept what he had just seen. He had thought the years of regret were behind him, buried deep within the layers of his new life. But in that moment, everything changed. The twins, walking so confidently beside their mother, looked exactly like him. The shock hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. They weren't just any children, these were his children, the ones he had abandoned without a second thought. His hands trembled as he put down his coffee cup. The reality of what he had done to his family, to his wife, and to those children, was now inescapable. The thought that he had been so blind, so self-centered to leave them behind, crushed him. He thought he could escape his past, but now it was here, right in front of him. His eyes followed them down the street. The twins laughed, oblivious to the man staring at them from inside the café. They were full of life, just like he had been at their age. They were everything he had lost. And in that instant it felt like all his success, all his wealth, had amounted to nothing. He had spent years chasing fleeting moments of happiness, thinking that a younger woman, a new life, could fulfill him. But in reality, it had only left him hollow. The silence in the café felt suffocating. He tried to make sense of it all. How could he have been so blind to the love he already had? The family he had walked away from? He could remember the joy in his ex-wife's eyes when they had first met. He could feel the warmth of their early days together. They had a connection, a bond that had once been so strong. How had it all slipped away? The truth was undeniable. The twins, the ones he had never known, were the living proof of his mistake. Every moment he had spent without them, every year that had passed, was a year that could never be reclaimed. The more he thought about it, the heavier the weight of his actions became. The pain in his chest intensified as he realized that he had missed their childhood, their milestones, their laughter. He had made a decision years ago, thinking he was choosing happiness. But what he had truly chosen was a path of regret, one that led him away from the most important people in his life. And now, as he watched those twins, he realized that he could never undo what he had done. The realization was sharp, painful, and inescapable. He had lost everything, and no amount of success or money could bring it back. He had traded his family for something fleeting, something that had ultimately left him more empty than before. The only thing left now was the raw truth of what he had sacrificed. The guilt washed over him like a flood, drowning everything else in its path. His chest tightened as the weight of his actions became unbearable. He sat in the café, unable to move, his mind reeling. He had always thought of himself as someone who made decisions for his own happiness, someone who deserved to follow his own desires. But now, seeing those twins, his own flesh and blood, he was struck by the painful truth. His choices had not brought him happiness. They had only brought emptiness. The memory of his wife's face, the way she had looked at him with love and trust, haunted him. How had he betrayed that? How could he have walked away from her, from their family, as if it meant nothing? He had told himself that he was entitled to happiness, that he deserved more than the life they had built together. But now, in the silence of that café, he realized how wrong he had been. His mind began to flash back to those years, years that he had thought he could forget. The moments of love, of connection with his wife. The way she had supported him, stood by him, through everything. How had he let that slip away for the fleeting thrill of something new, something exciting, something that now felt so shallow? He thought about the children he had missed growing up. The twins were so full of life, so innocent. They had lived without him, without the father they should have had, and he had no one to blame but himself. The painful reality of what he had sacrificed hit him harder with each passing second. His desire for something more had cost him the very thing that truly mattered. He began to wonder, would his wife have ever let him back into their lives if he had come to his senses sooner? Or had he permanently severed the bond between them? The thought of never knowing his children, of never being a part of their lives, was too much to bear. It was a wound that couldn't heal. He had spent years chasing something that wasn't real, a fleeting moment of excitement, and now it was too late. He couldn't change the past. The twins would grow up with someone else as their father, and his ex-wife would move on, as she had every right to do. As the reality set in, the man's vision blurred with tears. He had everything, wealth, power, success, but none of that mattered now. What mattered were the people he had lost, the family he had thrown away. He had traded it all for something that now seemed so insignificant. The emotional impact of his choices was undeniable, and it crushed him in ways he had never imagined. Unable to shake the image of his children, the billionaire couldn't sit idly by any longer. The guilt, the regret, it was overwhelming. He knew he had to act, had to confront the reality of what he had missed. He couldn't let them pass by like that again, walking down the street, oblivious to the man who had abandoned them. With a mix of fear and determination, he left the café and stepped into the street, following them at a distance. His mind raced with questions. How would she react? Could she ever forgive him? Would his children even know who he was? He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no turning back now. He finally caught up to them just outside a small park. The twins were laughing, unaware of the man approaching them. His ex-wife walked beside them, her eyes focused straight ahead, her expression calm and collected. It was clear she had moved on. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward her. The closer he got, the more nervous he became. He had thought about this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of it. As he neared her, she finally turned and saw him standing there, staring at her with wide, uncertain eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She looked at him as if seeing a ghost, and the silence between them was thick with years of unspoken words. Finally, she broke the silence. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with something he couldn't quite place. There was no anger, no bitterness in her tone, just an unsettling quiet. I had to see them," he replied, his voice faltering. "I had to see them for myself." She glanced at the twins, who were still unaware of the tension growing between the two adults. "They're fine. They don't need you now." Her words stung, more than he expected. He had known this moment would come, but hearing it from her, so matter-of-fact, so final, was like a slap to the face. The woman he once knew, the woman who had stood by him, was no longer the same. She had moved on. She had done what he couldn't. She had found strength and built a life without him. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't know." She paused for a moment, as if considering his words. Then she shook her head slowly. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." The twins, still laughing, turned to look at him for the first time. Their innocent faces, so full of life, were a mirror of the man's own. They didn't know who he was, and he wasn't sure they ever would. The man stood there, speechless, as the reality of his actions crashed down on him once again. There was no easy way to fix this. He had lost them, lost everything, and he was left with nothing but the consequences of his choices. The man stood there, his heart sinking as the words his ex-wife had spoken echoed in his mind. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." Those words hit harder than anything else she could have said. He had chosen to walk away, to leave behind a family that had loved him. In his pursuit of something more exciting, something that seemed like it would fill the emptiness inside him, he had thrown away everything that truly mattered. And now, as he stood before her, as he saw his children for the first time, he realized the price of his actions. Every decision he had made over the years led him here, standing on the edge of something he couldn't undo. He had made the conscious choice to abandon his wife, to leave behind a family that needed him. He had justified it all, told himself that he deserved better, that he was entitled to happiness. But now, looking at the twins, looking at them with their faces so identical to his own, he saw the full weight of that decision. What had he gained? Excitement? Youth? A fleeting sense of freedom? None of it had been enough to fill the emptiness he felt now. His life, once filled with luxury and thrill, had only left him hollow. The pain of missing out on their lives, on the simple joys of fatherhood, was something he couldn't ignore. He had missed their first steps, their first words, the milestones that every father should be there for. His eyes lingered on the twins as they played, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that churned within him. He couldn't be their father now, not in any real sense. They had grown up without him, without a father figure who should have been there to guide them, to love them. He had lost all of that, and it was his own doing. In that moment, the weight of his decisions pressed down on him like a ton of brick. He had been blind to what truly mattered. He had sacrificed love, family, and connection for something that wasn't real. The younger woman had given him nothing but an illusion, a temporary fix to his dissatisfaction, and now that illusion was fading. He couldn't go back to his wife, couldn't become the father his children deserved. The damage was irreversible. As he stood there, watching his ex-wife and the children walk away, he knew there was no way to make things right. He had lost them all. He had traded his future for something fleeting, and now there was nothing left but the painful realization of what he had sacrificed. The weight of his decisions would be with him forever, and it was a burden he could never escape. The man couldn't shake the feeling of deep emptiness that weighed on him now. Everything he had worked for, everything he thought he wanted, felt meaningless. His wealth, his success, the endless excitement, none of it mattered anymore. The consequences of his choices were too great, too permanent. He had thought he could escape his past, could build a new life filled with the excitement of a younger woman, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a hollow substitute for the love he had left behind. He had been selfish. In his quest for something better, something more thrilling, he had overlooked the things that really mattered, the people who had always been there for him. His ex-wife had given him everything, had stood by him through thick and thin, and he had taken it all for granted. He had thrown it all away without thinking of the consequences, without realizing how deeply it would affect those around him. The more he reflected on his past actions, the more he saw how self-centered they had been. He hadn't considered the pain he was causing. He hadn't thought about the children who would grow up without their father, who would never know the man he could have been to them. They were innocent in all of this, yet they were the ones who had paid the price for his selfishness. The weight of what he had done was unbearable. His heart ached as he thought about the years he had lost, the birthdays, the school plays, the everyday moments that a father should have been there for. They were all gone, erased by the decisions he had made in pursuit of his own desires. And now there was nothing he could do to get that time back. His relationship with the younger woman, the one he had left everything for, had faded. It had become a lifeless routine, a distraction from the pain he felt deep inside. He had sacrificed his family for fleeting pleasures, and now he was left with nothing but regret. As he walked through his empty house, the silence was deafening. There was no one to share his success with, no one to celebrate with. The emptiness in his heart mirrored the emptiness in his life. He had thought that money, success, and excitement would bring him happiness, but he had learned the hardest lesson of all. Those things could never replace the love and connection he had lost. The consequences of his selfishness were clear now, and they would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had made a choice, and it had cost him everything that truly mattered. No amount of wealth could ever bring back the family he had abandoned. Days passed, but the pain didn't subside. It lingered, gnawing at him with every quiet moment, every glance at his empty home. He had everything, wealth, status, luxury, but none of it meant a thing anymore. The high life he had once craved now felt suffocating. What had it all been for? The thrill of a younger lover, the rush of escaping the life he thought he no longer wanted? None of it brought him peace. He couldn't stop thinking about the choices he had made, the life he had abandoned. It wasn't just the twins, the children he had never known. It was the years spent chasing something that was never real. His marriage, his family, they had been real. They had been the foundation of everything that mattered, but in his selfishness, he had torn it all down. He had thrown away love for fleeting moments of excitement, and now, he was left with nothing but regret. He remembered the quiet moments with his ex-wife, the way they had once laughed together over dinner, the way she always knew just how to calm him when he was stressed. He had taken all of that for granted, and now, with every passing day, it became clearer how much he had lost. He could never go back to those moments, never feel the warmth of her touch, the security of her love. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him more heavily than ever. He had no one left to turn to. His relationship with the younger woman had crumbled, as he had known it would. It was built on the illusion of escape, and when that illusion faded, there was nothing left to hold it together. She was no longer the answer to his unhappiness. She was simply a distraction from the real problem, the emptiness inside him that he had tried so hard to ignore. He thought about his children again. They were growing up without him, without the love and guidance of a father who should have been there. He would never have those years with them, and the regret of that was unbearable. He couldn't undo the damage. He couldn't turn back time. As he sat alone in his office, staring at the life he had built, he realized just how empty it all was. The success, the wealth, none of it could fill the hole in his heart. He had learned the hardest lesson of all: the price of selfishness is steep, and it is a price that can never be paid back. He had lost everything that truly mattered, and there was no way to get it back. The reflection of his past mistakes was staring him in the face, and it was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the end, he realized that no amount of money or success could undo the damage he had caused. His choices, driven by selfishness, had led him down a path of regret. The life he thought would bring him happiness had only left him hollow, and now, he was forced to live with the consequences. He had sacrificed love, family, and the future for fleeting pleasures, and now those pleasures felt like empty memories. His ex-wife had moved on, and so had the children. The years he had missed were gone, irretrievable. The price of betrayal was inescapable, and no amount of wealth could ever make up for what he had lost. He had hoped that time would heal the wounds, but time only revealed the truth. What he had done could never be undone. The emptiness he felt now would stay with him forever, a reminder of the cost of his choices.